A Grand Prix can sometimes unexpectedly develop into mayhem on the track, and in the most unusual ways. At the Nurburgring, Lewis's chief mechanic had stayed at home to attend a wedding, meaning that I had to step in and take charge of his car and car crew for the weekend. I had a good chat with Lewis on Thursday. We small talked, discussed all the things we'd both been up to since the last race, and then about the way that we both worked and how we'd best operate together that weekend. He was relaxed and happy, and I looked forward to leading his guys through another, hopefully trouble-free and successful event. And come Saturday afternoon, we'd all gelled well together as a crew. Hey guys, welcome back to another Tales from the Treehouse. Following on from the heroics from Max Verstappen's car crew back at the Hungaroring just a weekend or so away, I thought I'd do a Tales from the Treehouse that was in some way related, because loads of people said to me, have you ever been in situations like that where the mechanics have literally pulled off a miracle to get the car into the race? And it immediately reminded me of this particular moment at the Nurburgring in 2007 with Lewis Hamilton. So as I said there, his chief mechanic had stayed at home. He wasn't at the race that weekend. That particular year I was in charge of the T car. I was the #1 mechanic on the T car that year, the third car in the garage. But because Lewis's chief mechanic had stayed away, I stepped in to take over, and I was really looking forward to it. It was a great opportunity to work even more closely with Lewis than I had done in the past. And you know, things were on the up for Lewis. Things were looking good. We were looking like we had a car capable of certainly challenging for right at the very front for race wins and podiums, and I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to make my direct contribution to the Lewis Hamilton story. The mood was confident ahead of qualifying. Unfortunately though, that was the last harmonious point of the weekend. Now, those who remember this particular weekend, it was, from our perspective, it was chaos. It was disastrous. The weather was all over the place. There was torrential rain on the race. We'll get to that in a moment. But even before that, on the Saturday afternoon in qualifying, we'd sent Lewis's car out. We did our standard pit stop, which we did for new tyres during the qualifying session. And after his pit stop, he went back out and had a failure on the car. The wheel detached from the upright. Lewis had no control, went off, hit the barriers in a really heavy shunt. So that was horrible. Seeing your driver do that is horrific. It's just a horrible experience. You don't know if it was your fault or somebody on your crew's fault. You don't know if the driver's okay. You know, there's those moments which are just stomach churning for a mechanic. But anyway, Lewis turned out, despite having a couple of knocks, he was fine. And it turned out that it was a faulty wheel gun that had been used in the pit stop that hadn't delivered the correct amount of torque doing up the wheel nut, and therefore the wheel had come off. Ultimately, it wasn't any of our direct fault. It wasn't something that we'd made a mistake with, which immediately takes a whole bunch of pressure off. But then we have to turn to getting the car fixed, of course, getting it turned around. After working late on Saturday night, changing all the bits we were allowed to change under part firme conditions, we finished the final tweaks on Sunday morning, and I ran Lewis through the work that we'd done. He was very grateful, asking me to pass on his thanks to everyone else, something that was always really appreciated. But on this occasion, I thought it might be better if he went a step further. It might be nice if you said thanks to the guys personally, I suggested. It would mean so much more to them coming from you. Lewis nodded and walked around the garage for a quick chat with the boys, which was a really nice touch. He was starting in 10th place that day. Winning was going to be a huge ask, but this little gesture just helped as a little bit of a rallying call. And it really does, you know, moments like that really help to galvanise the team. And like I thought this at the weekend when Max immediately on the formation lap, having had his crew throw his car back together in the most unbelievable way, Max was immediately on the radio saying how much he appreciated, how much, you know, he was grateful for what they'd managed to do. And it might be a tiny little thing, but those things make a difference to the team inside the garage. The European Grand Prix that year was a memorable one, but for all the wrong reasons, in our garage at least. It chucked it down right after the start and loads of people spun off into the gravel traps, including Lewis. Beached, he kept his engine running, stayed in the car and was craned back onto the racetrack, where he rejoined the race just before it was red flag. You might remember this. This was actually the thing that instigated a rule change where the marshals came in with a digger, with a crane, picked up Lewis whilst he was still sat in the car, still had the engine running, lifted him out of the gravel trap and popped him back onto the racetrack. He then was able to go round and reform up on the grid, because just after he got going again, they red flagged it. Ended the race and went for a restart, and everybody had to reconvene on the grid where absolute chaos ensued. Because of the confusion of when the red flag had come out, where people were, so many people had been off, the FIA had no idea really of what the actual order was, and it took ages to shuffle cars around on the grid to find your right grid spot. And eventually, as the moments settled down, the calm kicked in and the FIA realised, okay, we've got the right order of cars now, we'll start the restart procedure, which runs over about a period of 15 minutes. We had our procedures to go through at that point, and we gradually started to calm down, get back under control and settle into the protocols that we knew we had to follow. We finally arrived at our grid slot. The car was checked over for any serious damage. It was a bit battered and bruised, the bodywork peppered in gravel rash, but otherwise it had survived a fairly bumpy excursion through the gravel. A few minutes later, with everyone recomposed and back under control, standing at the front of the car, I signalled to the gearbox mechanic at the back to insert the external starter motor and fire up the engine for a warm-up. At that moment I remember thinking, thank goodness, you know, he'd been through a really hefty run through the gravel. You know, quite often you get bits that are broken off, deflectors, bodywork damage, bits of floor damage, which can really hamper your race. And we hadn't really had any of that. It actually survived, and I remember being so relieved that we didn't have a situation like Max Verstappen's crew where we had to start ripping the car apart in these final few moments under extreme pressure to get the thing back into the race. It seemed to be okay. The gearbox mechanic disappeared down out of sight below the rear wing, which was perfectly normal, but moments later his face told a worrying story on the way back up. Something was very wrong. This wasn't a guy who panicked easily. He was calm and collected and highly experienced, so I knew the issue was serious. Trying not to alert Lewis, sat in the car, of any potential situation, I walked around to the rear, asking his trainer to lean into the cockpit and chat to him while we worked out what was wrong. Now, the guy in question here, the gearbox mechanic, his face lost all colour. I knew immediately there was a major problem, which is clearly the very last thing that anybody wants. I went round to the back of the car and he showed me what had happened. The starter shaft, a long narrow tube that ran through the diffuser into the gearbox, in which the half-metre long starter motor probe was inserted to fire up the engine, was packed full of tiny stones. So as the car had spun off backwards through the gravel trap, this starter tube, this long tube which ran all the way from the back of the floor to the gearbox, was packed full of gravel, full of stones, and the only way to start the car back then, as opposed to now where you can use the MGUK, the onboard starter if you like, the only way to start the car back then was with this external starter. You had to shove it up this long tube, splines would engage with the gearbox at the far end, and that would turn the engine over via the gearbox, and then you could start the thing up. There was no other way to do it. So if we couldn't get the starter probe in, we weren't starting that car. We picked at the stones with long-nosed pliers and screwdrivers, but while we were able to clear most of it, that wasn't good enough. If just one stone was left in there, it would have prevented the starter from engaging with the splines in the gearbox at the far end, and we wouldn't be able to turn the engine over. This was now a real problem. Race control announced there were 10 minutes to the restart. Our engine was cooling down to way below the optimum temperature, and we still had no way of getting the thing going. And that's the other thing, you cannot start a Formula One engine from cold. You know, it has to have a minimum amount of temperature in there to allow all the tolerances to build up, to allow the clearances to be correct before you actually fire it up. And we do that normally on a cold morning in the garage by connecting up an external heater that cycles through hot water through the system, heats the oil as well, make sure everything's up to temperature before we fire it up. We couldn't do that on the grid. And now the temperature was dropping way below what Mercedes ever said we should ever start an engine below. It was getting really quite nerve-wracking and very serious. It was now clear to Lewis that there was something wrong, so I leant into the cockpit and reassured him that everything was all under control. Total lies. I then explained we were just getting the last few stones out. More lies. And would be firing up any moment. Even more lies. Back at the rear of the car, desperation was setting in. Long makeshift tools were being passed over the pit wall from the guys in the garage, and I updated everyone on the radio of what was going on in the calmest voice that I could manage. Now the team had swung into action. We had long metal rods taped together to reach the length of the tube. Balls of double-sided sticky tape had been attached to the end in an attempt to coax out the remaining stones. It was working, but there were still 1 or 2 stubborn pieces, each no bigger than 5 or 6 millimetres in diameter, right at the very end of the starter shaft, and the clock was ticking. I'd spoken to my chief engineer. I'd said to him, look, we will continue to try, we'll do everything we can, but there's a very real possibility we may not make the start of this race. With the 3-minute warning on the start light gantry appearing, we became desperate. I had no alternative but to tell the gearbox mechanic to smash the starter probe into position so we could get the engine fired up. It was risky, as it might have badly damaged something inside, but we were in serious danger of not getting the car started, both because of the time left before the race start, but also because the temperature was dropping below its safe, allowable limits. I knew it was a desperate measure, but I'd been left with limited options, and somebody had to make the call. Then, got it! Someone emerged from under the car, his Blue Peter-style stone grabber in hand. He'd removed the one remaining piece of gravel. Unbelievable, the relief fell over all of our faces. For all the lies I'd been telling Lewis, trying to convince him there wasn't really a problem, when he finally saw the relief on our faces, none of that would have mattered. He would have known that we were close to disaster, but it didn't matter anymore. We were now in the situation we could get the car started. Quickly, the starter probe went in and we quickly but cautiously restarted the car. The guys from Mercedes-Benz gently warmed the engine from its unusually cold temperature, and I talked Lewis through what we'd done whilst confirming that he was now in good shape for the restart. I can't really even begin to describe what that relief was like. Knowing that I'd stepped in to take charge of Lewis and of Lewis's car and of Lewis's car crew for that one weekend, we were seconds, literally seconds away from being the one weekend that year where we never even made the race start. I did not want to be responsible for that. And although clearly it wasn't actually my fault, that's what would have been the overwhelming feeling for me. And so once we got that shout, once someone said they'd got it, with the most un-F1-like of solutions of balls of sticky tape on the end of long rods that are taped together, it didn't matter how we'd done it. We'd got it out, we got the car started, and my goodness, the feeling in that second was unbelievable. The relief was almost overwhelming, but the euphoria was short-lived. After all that drama, I felt sure we deserved a good race recovery. Scoring a decent points haul for the championship fight would have been just rewards for all of our efforts. But it wasn't to be. A brave fight from Lewis and a tactical gamble or two on tyres in what proved to be extraordinarily mixed conditions didn't pay off. We finished 9th, just outside the top 8 scoring positions. Unbelievable. It was not quite the fairy tale ending that the guys at Red Bull had with Max Verstappen the other day, but I definitely appreciated and felt the pain that they were going through initially, having seen their driver spin off and hit the barrier. We had the same when Lewis was in the gravel. We then had that massive fall in emotion, that dip, when we realised there was a very serious problem on the car, a problem that could genuinely, and almost did, keep us out of the race. And you have to remember that when this is happening, it's not just you not being able to take part in a race. This is a race that you, your crew, your team, the driver, the team management, the hundreds and hundreds of people back at base had all put so much effort into preparing for, into getting ready for, trying to get the maximum out of. The millions of fans back at home who are all there just wanting their driver, Lewis Hamilton, to get the best result possible. And you don't want to be the guy or the team of guys that somehow lets that all down and stops it from happening. It was an unbelievable feeling to get the car going and getting back into the race. It felt like a victory in ourselves. I imagine that's exactly how the guys at Red Bull felt at the weekend. You'd done your work. Those moments are what you live for as a mechanic, because those are the moments that you and your crew can genuinely make a difference with. Without us on that day, Lewis would not have raced. The same for Max Verstappen at the weekend. It was a shame we didn't get the fairy tale result in the end, but do you know what? At points in that day, that didn't really matter. Giving Lewis the opportunity to go and fight for points or fight for a great result was what we had managed to achieve that day, and that felt like a little victory to us. There you go. I hope you enjoyed that one, guys. Appreciate you spending the time watching and listening. If you'd like to know more about the book, there is a link in the description of the video if you want to go and check it out. And of course, there's a whole playlist of these Tales from the Treehouse with a whole bunch of stories, most of them from within the book, that I've expanded on right here up in the Treehouse. And I'd love to know if there's anything else that you'd like me to pick out and talk about further too. So any stories that you think I might have been involved with, either from the book or otherwise, let me know and maybe we can make another episode right up here soon. Have a good one, guys. Enjoy the weekend and I'll see you very soon. Ta-da.